Director Cho said my name in the all-hands meeting, in front of 40 people, and the sentence he attached to it was, "We know the leak came from someone with access to the Hansong file, and I think we all understand that trust, once it's broken, is very hard to rebuild." He did not say I did it. He was too careful for that. He said my name, Young Ha-rin. "Will you stay after? We need to talk." And then he talked about trust and access and the Hansong file. And he let 40 people do the arithmetic themselves, which is how a certain kind of man accuses you. He never makes the claim. He just arranges the facts so that you are the only answer. And then he stands back and lets the room convict you in the privacy of its own head. The Hansong file was the confidential term sheet for our biggest pending deal, and it had turned up 3 days earlier, in the hands of our largest competitor. Close enough to verbatim that there was no question it had been taken, not guessed. And I had access to it. That was true. I was one of 11 people who had access to it. But I was the most convenient of the 11. Mid-level. No mentor, no protector. The kind of person a company can lose without anyone important having to feel bad about it. And so, in the 4 days between the leak and that meeting, the story had already quietly formed, in the way stories form in offices, and by the time Director Cho said my name, he was not starting the accusation. He was ratifying one that the building had already agreed on. I know all of this because I had lived it. In the version of my life I'm not going to spend much time on. I stood up in that meeting. I said it wasn't me. I said it too fast and too loud. And my voice did the thing that a wrongly accused voice does, which is to climb, to crack, to plead. And 40 people watched me plead. And every single one of them read the pleading the way people always read it, which is not as innocence but as panic. And panic, in the collective imagination, is what guilt looks like. I spent the next 6 weeks defending myself. I sent emails proving where I'd been. I cornered colleagues to explain. I demanded to see evidence, and was told the investigation was ongoing, and the harder I fought to prove I hadn't done it, the guiltier I looked. Because innocent people, everyone knows, don't need to fight this hard, an assumption that is exactly backwards and universally believed. They fired me in the end. Not for the leak. Officially, it was restructuring, because they never actually proved anything, because they never actually looked hard enough to prove anything, because once the building had decided it was me. The investigation's job was not to find the leaker, but to confirm the leaker they had already chosen. I left under a cloud that followed me to every interview after, because reference calls are made in the same careful voice Director Cho used. No one said she leaked. They just said, "We can't really comment on the circumstances of her departure," which is the sentence that ends a career without leaving fingerprints. And the real leaker was never caught. That is the part that took me years to stop thinking about. Someone in that building had taken the Hansong file and handed it to our competitor, and because everyone was so busy watching me plead, no one ever pulled the one thing that would have named them. The person who did it watched me take the fall, and kept their job, and was probably in that all-hands meeting nodding along about trust. Then I opened my eyes, and Director Cho was standing at the front of the room saying my name, Young Ha-rin. "Will you stay after?" And I understood, with a calm that felt like cold water down my spine, that I was back at the exact hour of my ruin, and that this time I was not going to say a single word in my own defense, because I had finally understood the thing that a whole first life had hidden from me behind my own panic. The accusation was not the danger. My defense was the danger. The accusation was just a cloud. It would have dissolved on its own if I had let it, because there was no evidence in it. Only convenience. What had destroyed me last time was not their suspicion. It was my performance of innocence. which gave the suspicion something to feed on. Which turned a vague office rumor into a 6-week spectacle starring a woman who protested too much. They had accused me of being the leak, and then I had done their work for them. By leaking. Everywhere. All over that building. The one thing that I stayed after the meeting, as instructed. And Director Cho and the HR manager and a man from legal sat across a table from me, and they waited for me to defend myself, because that was the script, and my defending myself was the load-bearing beam of their entire case. I want to explain that, because it is the mechanism, and I did not understand it for a whole lifetime. An accusation with no evidence needs your reaction to survive. If I sat there and protested, they had a scene. An emotional, escalating, memorable scene, and a scene can be characterized, can be described later as she got very defensive. She was almost aggressive about it. She wouldn't let it go. My protest would become the evidence, because they had no other evidence. And a person's overreaction to being accused is the one thing an accuser can always manufacture and always use. They were not waiting to hear my defense, so they could weigh it. They were waiting for my defense so they could hold it up as the thing that convicted me. So I did not give it to them. Director Cho opened with the reasonable version of the accusation, the one designed to draw out the denial. Ha-rin, I want to be clear. No one is saying anything definite. But the Hansong file leaked, and you had access. And I think the honest thing, the thing that would help all of us, is for you to be straightforward with us now. The old me would have said it wasn't me. I would never. How could you think? And would have watched 3 professionals note the pitch of my voice. This time I folded my hands on the table. And I said, calmly, that sounds like a serious situation for the company. What's the plan for investigating it? There was a small silence, because that was not the sentence they had prepared for. They had a whole set of responses ready for a denial. The gentle pressure. The we just want the truth. The it'll go easier if you're honest. They had nothing ready for a woman who received the accusation as though it were news about someone else and asked, mildly, about process. The plan, Director Cho said, recovering, depends somewhat on cooperation. If the person responsible comes forward. Of course, I said, but if no one comes forward, how does the company actually determine who accessed and exported the file? I assume there's a technical record. There must be. The Hanseong folder is on the secure server. And the secure server logs access, doesn't it? Every open, every download, every export, with a user ID and a timestamp, and the device. So really this should be very solvable. You just pull the access log for that file and see exactly who exported it and when. I looked at him, pleasantly, with the open face of a person who has nothing to fear from a record. I'd feel much better if you did that. Honestly, for my own sake, I don't want to be under a cloud because of an assumption. I'd rather the log just show what happened. I watched that land, and I watched something move behind Director Cho's careful face, and it was the first crack. Though I did not fully understand it yet, because a man running a fair investigation would have said yes. Of course, we're pulling the logs. That's standard. And Director Cho did not say that. He said, the logs can be complicated. Access doesn't always mean what people think. Someone can open a file for legitimate reasons. Complicated. The logs, which are the least complicated thing in any building, a simple ledger of who touched what, when were, in Director Cho's telling, suddenly complicated, and I understood. Sitting there with my folded hands, the shapes of what I was inside. This was not an investigation that had failed to look at the logs. This was an investigation that did not want to look at the logs. Someone had already glanced at that access record, in the 4 days between the leak and the meeting. and had seen a name in it, and the name was not mine, and the name was inconvenient, protected, favored, expensive to accuse. And so the decision had been made, quietly, to solve the leak, not by reading the record, but by finding a person the record could be ignored in favor of. They needed a leaker who did not require them to look at the log. They needed me. The man from legal watched me while Cho fumbled with the word complicated, and I noticed him notice. He was the only one in the room whose job was not to protect a narrative, but to protect the company from liability. And a lawyer hears a certain frequency when a manager calls a simple record complicated in front of an employee who has just calmly requested it. He did not say anything. He just made a small note on his pad. And I understood that the note was not about me. It was the first grain of the thing I would later build into an avalanche. The first professional in that building to register that the person avoiding the log was the manager, not the accused. "I don't think it's complicated at all," I said, still mild, still folded. "I think it's the simplest thing in the world. Pull the log. I'm happy to wait." And I did not say another word in my defense. Then or ever. Because I had just realized that my defense was worthless, and the log was worth everything, and that my entire job, from this moment, was to say nothing that could be used, and to make it as difficult as possible. The name in the log was Han Yumi, and I knew it before anyone confirmed it, because I had spent a whole first life not knowing it. And the not knowing had cost me everything. Yumi was the golden one. Every office has a golden one. The person whose competence everyone assumes because they carry themselves as though it has already been established. Who is mentored by the people who matter. Who is being groomed, quietly, for the thing you will never be offered. Director Cho had brought her in himself. She was his protégé, his bet, the young star he was attaching his own reputation to. And Yumi had access to the Hansong file too. Because Yumi had access to everything, because access flows toward the favored, the way it flows away from the convenient. I did not know. In my first life. That Yumi was the leak. I only knew it in this one. Because in this one, I had the years of hindsight that told me the leak was never caught and that the person who benefited most from my ruin was the person whose star kept rising in the space my absence left. Yumi got the promotion that had been notionally mine. Yumi led the Hansong deal's replacement. Yumi. I learned much later. Moved to the competitor 2 years after, the same competitor the file had gone to, at a level and salary that a 2-year senior analyst does not simply earn. The file had been her resume. She had sold our biggest deal to buy her next job. And she had let me be the cost of it. And she had done it so cleanly that I had spent years believing the leaker was some faceless stranger, when I had sat 4 desks from her the whole time. So this time I knew where to look. But knowing is not the same as proving. And here's the thing I had to be very disciplined about. I could not accuse Yumi. That was crucial. And it was the mirror image of my old mistake. In my first life, I destroyed myself by defending myself. If I now destroyed myself by accusing someone else, I would have learned nothing. An accusation from the office scapegoat against the director's protégé, with no proof, would have been suicide. She took it. Not me. Look at her, would have sounded exactly like the desperate deflection of a guilty person, and would have handed Director Cho the perfect ending. The leak, cornered, is now smearing an innocent colleague. I would have become guiltier by pointing. I could not accuse. I could only make the log get read. That was the entire game. And it was a game of pressure, not of noise. The company did not want to read the log, because the log named Yumi, and reading it would force Director Cho to choose between his protégé and the truth, a choice he had already made by choosing me. My job was to raise the cost of not reading the log until it exceeded the cost of protecting Yumi. And I had to do it without ever once saying her name, without ever once defending myself. In a voice so calm and so reasonable that nothing I said could be characterized as anything but a wrongly suspected employee's entirely proper request for due process. So I put it in writing. This was the first move, and it was the one that changed everything, because a thing in writing cannot be unsaid and cannot be quietly not done. The morning after the meeting, I sent an email to Director Cho, copied to HR and to legal, the same three who had sat across the table, and it was short, and it was warm, and it was devastating precisely because it was so reasonable. I wrote that I took the security of the Hanseong file very seriously, that I wanted to fully cooperate with any investigation, and that to that end I was formally requesting that the company conduct a complete forensic audit of the secure server's access logs for the file, so that the matter could be resolved definitively and fairly for everyone involved, myself included. I said I was confident the records would clarify exactly what happened. I thanked them for their diligence. And I hit send. And I copied legal. And in doing so, I moved the log from a thing the company could quietly avoid into a thing the company was now. In writing. On record. Formally requested by an accused employee to examine if they now declined to pull the log. That refusal was itself documented. A company that accuses an employee of a leak and then refuses her written request for the forensic record that would clear or convict her is a company building itself a lawsuit. I had not accused anyone. I had not defended myself. I had simply, in the mildest possible language, made the one document they were hiding from into the one document for a week. Nothing happened, and the nothing was its own kind of pressure, applied to me, to make me crack. This is what they do when they cannot use your defense, because you have not given them one. They use the silence. They let you sit in it. No one told me anything. Director Cho did not reply to my email for 3 days. And when he did, it was a single line. Thank you. We'll handle the investigation appropriately. That acknowledged nothing and promised nothing. I was moved. Quietly. Off the active projects. While things are sorted out. Which is the corporate version of being put in a holding cell. My badge still worked, but my calendar emptied. Colleagues who used to eat lunch with me developed sudden deadlines. I existed. That week, in the specific isolation of the accused but not charged, where everyone has decided you did it, but no one will say so. So there is nothing to answer. Only a temperature, a coolness in every hallway. The particular way people's eyes slide off you at the coffee machine. In my first life this week broke me, because I spent it doing the thing the isolation was designed to make me do, which was to fill the silence with my own noise. I emailed people to explain. I asked to meet with Cho again. I wrote a long document laying out my innocence and my whereabouts and my character. And I sent it around. And every word of it was more fuel, more panic, more evidence of a woman who could not let it go. The isolation was a vacuum, and I rushed to fill it with my defense. And my defense was oxygen for a fire that would otherwise have starved. This time I let the silence stay silent. I did my remaining small tasks. I ate lunch alone, calmly, reading, in full view, because a person eating a sandwich and reading a book is not a person consumed by guilt. And the calm was itself a kind of statement that could not be characterized as anything. I did not email anyone to explain. I did not corner Cho. I let the week be as quiet on my end as it was cold. And I understood that the quiet was working on them more than it was working on me. Because a scapegoat who panics confirms the story. And a scapegoat who reads a novel at lunch and has already put a forensic audit request in writing to legal is a scapegoat who is starting to look, to anyone paying attention, like she might not be a scapegoat at all. Midway through that silent week, Director Cho tried the move that the silence was always building toward, which was to offer me a quiet exit. He called me into his office, not the conference room this time. No HR, no legal. Just the two of us. Which was itself information. Because the things a man says with no witnesses are the things he does not want on a record. He was warm, almost sorrowful. He said that this was a terrible situation, that he could see it was taking a toll on me, that these investigations could drag on for months and be so hard on a person, and that sometimes the kindest thing, for everyone, was a clean break. He said that if I chose to resign now, for personal reasons, nothing to do with any of this, the company would provide a neutral, even warm, reference, and we could all move on. And I could put this behind me and start fresh somewhere the cloud would never follow. It was. I understood. The whole trap in a single offer. Resign for personal reasons meant close the case with my departure so the log never has to be read. The neutral reference was the bait. The buried truth was the price. In my first life, I did not get this offer. Because in my first life, I was too busy pleading to be worth managing quietly. They simply fired me at the end. But here, because I had gone calm. I had become a problem that could still be solved cheaply. And Cho was trying to solve me before the log could solve him. I did not get angry, and I did not accept, I said, mildly. That's kind of you to think of my well-being. But I haven't done anything, so resigning would feel like admitting I had. And I'd rather not carry that. Even for a good reference, I'm comfortable waiting for the investigation. I trust the process, especially the forensic audit. Once it's done, I watched him hear the word forensic, and I watched him understand that I was not going to hand him the quiet exit that closed the file. And I saw, for just a moment, something close to fear cross the careful face of a man who had just realized that his convenient scapegoat was not going to be convenient after all, and that the only remaining way to stop the log from being read was one he did not yet have. And people were paying attention. That was the thing the isolation could not account for. The building had 40 people in it, and not all 40 had signed on to the story with equal conviction. And a few of them, the observant ones, the ones who watch more than they talk, noticed the shape of what was happening. They noticed that the accused woman was strangely calm. They noticed that she had. They'd heard. Formally requested the logs, which is not what a guilty person requests. And most of all, they noticed the thing I was noticing, which was that Yumi, the golden one, had gone subtly wrong that week, a little too bright, a little too present in Director Cho's office, a fraction too eager to be helpful with the investigation. In the way a person is eager to steer a car away from a particular street. The one who came to me was a junior analyst named Minji, who I barely knew, who sat down across from me at my isolated lunch table on the Thursday of that week and said, quietly, not quite meeting my eyes, I pulled a file from the Hanseong folder in March, for a totally normal reason, for the market summary. And this week I got scared, because I realized my name is probably in that access log too, along with everyone who ever legitimately opened it. And if they're just looking for a name with access to blame, it could be any of us. It could be me. She looked at me then. So I've been thinking about how they decided it was you and not me, when we both had access. And the only difference I can find is that you're easier to blame than I am, and I'm easier to blame than you me, and that's not an investigation. That's a ranking of who's convenient. And I didn't want to just watch it happen to you without saying that out loud to at least one person. I did not tell Minji what I knew about Yumi. It was not safe for her to carry it, and it was not proven. And an alliance built on a shared accusation is as dangerous as an accusation made alone. But I said, thank you. You're right that access isn't guilt. That's exactly why I asked them to actually read the log instead of just ranking us by convenience. A log shows who exported the file, not just who could have. Those are very different lists. And I watched Minji understand the distinction, access versus action. The 11 who could versus the 1 who did. And I watched her realize that the log did not threaten the innocent at all. That it was in fact the innocent's only friend. And that the only person in the building, the thing that finally forced the log open, was not me. It was money, which is the only force in a company reliably stronger than a director protecting his protege. The Hansong leak had not just embarrassed us, it had cost us the deal. Hansong signed with the competitor, using terms that were suspiciously, provably close to ours, and a lost deal of that size is not a rumor to be managed. It is a hole in a quarter. A number the board asks about. A loss that someone senior has to explain to people more senior than a director. And a loss like that has a second life. Because a company that has had its trade secret stolen has options, an insurance claim for the loss, and potentially a legal action against the competitor for using misappropriated confidential information. Both of those are real money, recoverable money, the kind of money a board does not leave on the table. And here is the thing about both of those options that Director Cho, in his hurry to pin the leak on a convenient analyst, had not fully reckoned with. Neither of them works on a vibe. An insurer does not pay out a trade secret loss because a company informally suspects an employee. A court does not find against a competitor because a director had a feeling. Both require a forensic determination, a real, documented, defensible finding of how the file actually left the building, produced by a real forensic examination of the actual records, ideally by an external firm whose independence the insurer and the court will accept, to recover the money. The company had to prove the mechanism of the theft, and you cannot prove the mechanism of the theft without reading the log. I did not have to force this. I only had to make sure the right people saw it. In writing, framed as loyalty. So I sent one more email, this time to legal directly. Warm, constructive. The email of an employee who cares about the company's recovery rather than her own defense. I wrote that I understood the company might be considering an insurance claim or action against the competitor over the Hanseong matter, and that, having worked adjacent to the secure server, I wanted to flag helpfully that any such claim would almost certainly require a formal forensic audit of the file's access and export logs by an accredited external examiner, since insurers and courts require documented proof of exfiltration rather than internal assessment. I offered to assist however I could. I signed it warmly. It was the most useful email I have ever sent, and it did not contain a single word about my own innocence or anyone else's guilt. It simply pointed out, to the one department that answered to the board rather than to Director Cho, that the money the board wanted could not be recovered without the exact document Director Cho was avoiding. I had aligned my exoneration with the company's balance sheet. I no longer needed anyone to believe me. I only needed the board to want its money back. Which boards always do, and to learn that the only path to it ran directly through the log. Legal understood immediately. Because legal always understands money. Within a week, an external forensic firm was engaged, not to investigate me, but to substantiate the company's loss for the insurer and a possible claim against the competitor. Director Cho could not object to it, because objecting to the recovery of a 7-figure loss in front of the board would have been career suicide. Would have raised the one question he could never afford. Why would a director not want to know exactly how his company's biggest secret was stolen? He had built his whole strategy on the log staying closed. And now the log had to be opened. Not by the scapegoat he could dismiss, but by an external examiner the board had hired to get its money. And there was nothing he could do but sit in his office and watch the one record he had buried get exhumed by people he did not control. for reasons that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the number in the hole in the quarter. I had not cleared my name. I had made my name irrelevant, and made the truth profitable, and let the company's own greed do the excavating that the forensic firm needed 9 days, and the log said what a log always says, which is exactly what happened. In the flat, unarguable language of timestamps, I never saw the full report. I did not need to. The shape of it reached me the way the truth reaches you in a building once it can no longer be contained. But I know the essential lines of it, because they became, briefly, the only thing anyone in that company talked about. The Hansong term sheet had been opened many times, by many of the 11 with access, for many legitimate reasons, the ordinary traffic of a live deal, but it had been exported, once, converted to a personal format, and moved off the secure server to a device that was not company-issued. At 11:47 on a Tuesday night, 3 days before the leak surfaced, by a single user account, and the account was Han Yumi's, and the external examiner traced the exported copy's onward path far enough to make the rest a formality. The external examiner's method was the part I found beautiful, in a cold way, because it was the opposite of everything the office had done for 11 weeks. The office had worked backward from a conclusion, it is Harin, and gathered the vibe to support it. The examiner worked forward from the data, with no conclusion at all, no favorites, no convenient answer to protect, just the server's own records read in order. He did not ask who seemed guilty. He asked what the file did, and a file, it turns out, leaves a trail as specific as a fingerprint, every open logged with a user and a time, every copy logged, every export logged with the destination, every movement off the secure environment flagged, because secure servers are built precisely to record the one event that matters, which is not who looked, but who took. The examiner did not need to interview a single person. He did not need to weigh anyone's character or notice anyone's calm or panic. He needed 9 days and the server's own memory, and at the end of it, he produced a document that no amount of office politics could argue with, because it had not been produced by the office and did not answer to it. Access is a list of everyone who could. Export is a list of who did. That was the whole distinction I had staked everything on. The distinction I had spent a first life not understanding while I pled my innocence. And it was, in the end, the entire case. 11 people could have. One person. At 11:47 on a Tuesday night. From a personal device. Actually did. The log did not care that she was the golden one. The log did not care that she was the director's protégé, or that she carried herself as though her competence were already established, or that she was expensive to accuse. The log had recorded a timestamp and a user ID with the total indifference of a machine, and no amount of favor could reach back into that record and make 11:47 not have happened, or make the account not have been hers. Yumi did the thing that guilty people do when a record surfaces, which is the exact thing I had done in my first life when innocent. She panicked, and she defended herself, loudly, and her defense destroyed her the way mine had destroyed me, except that hers was destroying a true accusation instead of a false one. She said her account must have been compromised. She said someone must have used her login. She said it was a setup, that the timestamps could be faked, that she was being framed by, and here she reached, at last, for the oldest move, and pointed at me, said it was probably Harin. Harin who'd been so strangely calm. Harin who'd wanted the log so badly. Wasn't that suspicious? Why would the accused push for an audit unless she'd found a way to rig it? And it did not work. And watching it not work was the strangest vindication of my 2 lives. Because it failed for the exact reason my own true defense had failed the first time. She was performing innocence over a record. And a performance cannot out-argue a record. The 1147 export from her account to her personal device was not a vibe that could be respun. It was a fact with a timestamp, produced by an external examiner the board trusted. And her escalating denials did to her precisely what my escalating denials had done to me. They made her look like exactly what she was. Because loud innocence and loud guilt sound identical from the outside. And the only thing that ever tells them apart is the record underneath. And the record underneath was hers. Director Cho's collapse was quieter and, to me, more instructive. He did not get to be shocked, because shock would have required him not to have known. And the whole building now understood that he had seen the log early, or had been told what was in it, and had chosen, in those first 4 days, to bury it and blame me, rather than face what it said about the young star he had staked his own name on. His crime was no longer the leak. His crime was the cover. And the cover was worse than the leak. Because the leak was one greedy analyst, and the cover was a director corrupting an investigation to protect his protégé and sacrifice an innocent employee. And that is the kind of thing that ends not just a protégé's career, but the career of the man who chose her over the truth. The board did not forgive Cho for the buried log. You can survive being the director whose protégé leaked. You cannot survive being the director who knew and framed someone else. Because the framing exposes the board to exactly the lawsuit I had spent the whole time quietly making unavoidable, the wrongful suspicion of an employee suit whose evidence was now sitting, time-stamped, in legal's own files. Requested it, they wanted me to stay. That was the part I had not anticipated. And it taught me the final thing I needed to know about the difference between being cleared and being valued. Once the log was read, and the shape of it was undeniable, the company's posture toward me reversed with a speed that was almost obscene. Yumi was gone within the day. Director Cho was gone within the week. In the quiet way senior men are removed. A decision to pursue other opportunities that fooled no one. And suddenly, I was not the convenient scapegoat, but the wronged employee. And a wronged employee with a documented paper trail is a liability that companies prefer to convert into a grateful, retained, quietly settled employee. HR became warm, a new director, brought in over the wreckage, took me to a careful lunch and spoke about how valued I was, how the company wanted to make things right, how there might be a promotion in it, a team of my own, a fresh start with the past behind us. They were offering me the thing I had wanted my whole first life, to be believed, to be valued, to be restored, to have the cloud lifted and replaced with a title. And I sat at that careful lunch and I felt where the gratitude was supposed to be, a cool and total clarity, because I finally understood what the offer actually was. They did not value me. They had never valued me. 11 weeks earlier, this same company, through this same HR department, had been prepared to end my career to avoid reading a document. And the only thing that had changed was not their opinion of my character, but the direction of their exposure. When blaming me was convenient, they blamed me. Now that keeping me happy was convenient, now that a settled, promoted, grateful me was cheaper than a litigating, vindicated, angry me. They valued me. The valuing and the blaming came from the exact same place, which was not any assessment of who I was, but a running calculation of what I cost. I had been convenient to destroy, and now I was convenient to reward. And a person who understands that these are the same gesture pointed in different directions cannot be bought by the second one, because she remembers the first. There was a moment at that careful lunch that crystallized it for me. The new director, spreading the offer out warmly, said, "The company deeply regrets what you went through. We should never have doubted you." and I looked at him. This man who had not even worked here during the 11 weeks, apologizing on behalf of an institution for a doubt that had never really been a doubt but a decision. And I said, gently, the company didn't doubt me. Doubt would have meant it was uncertain. It wasn't uncertain. It picked me because I was the cheapest person to be certain about. That's not doubt. That's a budget. He did not know what to say to that. Because there was nothing to say. Because it was true. And when we both knew that the warmth he was offering me now came from the exact same budget, that I had simply moved, on the spreadsheet, from the column marked cheapest to blame to the column marked cheapest to keep quiet. And that my character had never once been a line item in either calculation. The apology was not for having wronged me. The apology was a cost of retaining me, and a person cannot be healed by an apology that is really an invoice. So I did not take the promotion. I took the settlement because I had earned it. Because the documented wrongful suspicion was real and mine to be compensated for. And because I had learned, across 2 lives, that leaving with dignity and leaving with what you are owed are not opposites. And then I left. Not dramatically. I did not give a speech about their corruption or send an all-staff email indicting the culture. I simply declined the fresh start. Accepted the compensation my lawyer negotiated cleanly, and walked out of a building that had been willing to bury me under a log rather than read it. And I did not look back, because there was nothing in that building I wanted. Least of all the belated regard of people whose regard was only ever a function of my usefulness to them. I went to a smaller company, in the end, a less glamorous one, where I do careful work with careful people, and where, this is the only thing I checked, in the interview, the only question that mattered to me now, the access logs are audited routinely, automatically, monthly, by an external firm. Not because anyone is suspected, but because a company that reads its own records as a matter of course is a company that can never quietly decide to blame the convenient person instead of the true one. I did not choose it for the salary, which was lower. I chose it because it was a building that had already decided, structurally, before I ever arrived, that the log gets read, and a building where the log always gets read is the only kind of building where a person like me, mid-level, unprotected, convenient, is actually safe. Because in that building, convenience cannot overrule the timestamp, and the people who had let their eyes slide off me at the coffee machine came back. Of course, once the log was read, and the way they came back taught me not to trust the return. They came back apologetic. Most of them. In the specific register of people apologizing for a thing they want to believe they did not really do. I never thought it was you, they said, which was a lie, because their eyes had told a different story for 11 weeks. I always knew something was off about that whole thing, they said, which was also a lie, because if they had known, they would have said so when it cost something to say it, and none of them had what they meant underneath the words. I am uncomfortable now that the record contradicts the story I quietly believed. And I would like you to relieve my discomfort by accepting an apology that costs me nothing, and restores the version of myself in which I was never one of the people who looked away. I did not relieve them. I was not unkind about it. I simply said, it was a hard situation for everyone, and let them sit in the ambiguity of whether that was forgiveness, because it was not forgiveness. And I saw no reason to hand out absolution to people who had been perfectly willing to watch me drown as long as the drowning was convenient and quiet. What fascinated me most, watching the building reorganize itself around the log, was how completely everyone rewrote their own memory of the 11 weeks. People who had cooled toward me now remembered themselves as having always been troubled by the case. People who had repeated the rumor now remembered themselves as having questioned it, the story the building told about itself, after. was that it had been a confusing situation in which reasonable people had briefly been misled, and not what it actually was. Which was a building that had found it easier to destroy a convenient woman than to read a document. Right up until reading the document became profitable. No one remembered choosing the convenient story. They remembered being victims of it, misled by circumstances. As blameless as the weather, it was the same move the whole institution ran. Scaled down to 40 individual consciences, everything that happened to them. No one had done anything. And I understood, watching it, that this is why it will happen again. In that building and in every building, to the next convenient person after me. The log cleared my name, but it did not change the thing that had accused me. Because the thing that had accused me was not a belief that could be corrected by evidence. It was a reflex. The reflex of a group under pressure to resolve a threat by assigning it to whoever is cheapest to blame. Evidence can overturn a verdict. It cannot cure the reflex that produced it. The next time a file leaks in that building, the same machinery will turn toward the same kind of person, mid-level, unprotected, convenient. And the only thing that saved me, the external audit, will have to be forced open all over again by whoever is unlucky enough to be chosen next, if they are calm enough and disciplined enough to force it, which most people, in the grip of the terror of being wrongly accused, are not. I was not cleared because the building learned. I was cleared because I made the record get read. Those are very different things. And mistaking the second for the first is how you walk back into the same building expecting it to have changed. The exception, the one I did keep, was Minji. Minji had sat down at my isolated lunch table on the Thursday of the worst week, when it still cost something to be seen with me, when I was still the leak and she was still a junior with a career to protect, and she had said the true thing out loud, that it was a ranking of convenience, not an investigation, and she had said it before the log made it safe to say, that is the only kind of ally worth having. The one who says the true thing while it is still dangerous, and there are almost none of them, and you should keep the ones you find. When I left, I made sure Minji had my number, and we are, years later, still the kind of friends that a shared bad season makes. Not warm, exactly, but bonded by having both seen, up close, how quickly a building will choose the convenient story over the true one, and how few people will say anything while it happens. Yumi I heard about only once more. She did not. It turned out, have a soft landing. The competitor she had been building her exit toward could hardly hire the analyst whose theft had just become a documented forensic finding and the subject of a legal claim. Because the exposed leaker is useless to everyone, including the people she leaked to, who need deniability more than they need her. The thing she had stolen our biggest deal to buy, her next job, her rising star. Her escape from being merely favored into being genuinely senior evaporated the instant the log named her, because a stolen credential, like a stolen deal, is only worth anything as long as no one checks the record. And someone had finally checked the record. She had sold a true thing, our confidential file, to buy a false thing, a reputation she had not earned. And when the true thing was traced back to the false one, both collapsed together, and she was left holding neither. I felt, when I heard it, almost nothing, not triumph, not pity, just the flat neutral acknowledgement of a log confirming a timestamp, which is, I have come to think, the correct emotional response to watching a person be caught by the exact record they gambled no one would read. And Director Cho, the careful man who never quite made the accusation, who arranged the facts and let the room convict me, who saw the log and buried it, and chose his protégé over the truth in me as the price, Cho left the industry entirely, because the specific thing he had done, corrupting an investigation to frame an innocent employee, is the one workplace sin that follows a senior person even in a world that forgives almost everything. Because it makes him a legal liability wherever he goes. A man whose judgment cost a company a lawsuit. He had spent his authority protecting the wrong person. And authority spent that way does not come back. I did not do that to him. I want to be exact. In the language of the log, I did not falsify a single record, accuse a single person, or say one untrue word. I only declined to defend myself, made the truth profitable, and let a man who had buried a document be buried by it. Everything that happened to Cho, he authored himself. In the 4 days when he chose not to read a log because he was afraid of what it said, the log did the rest. The log was always going to do the rest. I have thought a great deal since about the difference between the 2 times I stood accused, because the accusation was identical and the outcome was opposite, and the only variable that changed was me. Both times, someone with power arranged the facts so that I was the convenient answer to a leak I did not commit. Both times. There was no real evidence, only access and inconvenience. Both times. A log existed that would have told the truth. The situations were the same down to the timestamp, and in one life I was destroyed, and in the other, I was cleared. And the difference was not the evidence, which was the same, and not my innocence, which was the same, and not even the log, which existed both times. The difference was that the first time I defended myself, and the second time, I did not. This is the thing I most want to leave you with, because it is the least intuitive lesson I have ever learned, and it cost me a life to learn it. When you are falsely accused, your defense is the danger, not the accusation. The accusation, if it has no evidence, is only a cloud, and clouds disperse, unless you feed them. And the way you feed an evidence-free accusation is by reacting to it, because your reaction is the only material the accuser has. They cannot prove you did it. They have nothing, so they need you to supply the missing evidence yourself, in the form of your panic, your over-explanation, your too loud, too fast, too desperate innocence, which everyone in the room will read as guilt, because loud innocence and loud guilt are physically indistinguishable, and the crowd has never once, in the history of crowds, been able to tell them apart. The frightened innocent and the cornered guilty make the same sounds. So the moment you make those sounds, you have handed the accusation the only thing it was missing, which was you, performing the part of the guilty. The way out is almost unbearable, because it requires you to do the opposite of everything your body screams. It requires you to be calm while people believe the worst of you. It requires you to eat your lunch and read your book while the building decides you are a criminal. It requires you to not explain, not plead, not corner anyone, not send the long document of your character, because all of that is fuel, and the fire will starve without it. And then, this is the active part. The part that is not passivity. It requires you to quietly, in writing, in the mildest possible language, force the neutral record to be read, not to accuse anyone, not to defend yourself, just to make the log get pulled by someone the accuser does not control, for reasons the accuser cannot object to, because the log does not panic, the log does not over-explain, the log cannot be characterized as defensive or aggressive or bitter. The log has no pitch to its voice that can climb or crack. It simply sits there, being true, recording who did what and when with the total indifference of a machine. And it is, when you are innocent, the only thing in the entire building that is genuinely on your side, and it is on your side precisely because it does not care about you at all. I trusted the wrong thing. My first life. I trusted that if I could just make them believe me, I would be safe. But belief was never available to me. The building had decided. And you cannot argue a building out of a decision it finds convenient. What was available to me, both times, was the record, and the first time I ignored it in favor of my own voice, and the second time I went quiet and let it speak, and that was the whole difference between a ruined life and a cleared name. I do not trust institutions anymore, and I do not think I should. An institution will blame you when blaming you is convenient, and value you when valuing you is convenient. And both come from the same cold calculation, and neither is about you. But I trust the record. I have made my peace with a strange, narrow kind of faith, not in people, who will believe whatever costs them least, and not in fairness, which is not a force that exists in a hallway, but in the log, the time-stamped, indifferent, uncharmable record of what actually happened, which is the only friend the convenient and the unprotected have ever had. They called me the leak in front of 40 people, and I said nothing, and I made them read the log. And the log, caring nothing for me, told the truth about me, which is more than any of the 40 people ever did. Be quiet, feed the fire nothing, and go find the record, and make them read it. And let the thing that cannot panic say the thing your panic never could. The people who accused me have all forgotten they did it. The log has not forgotten anything. That is the difference between a person and a record. And it is the only difference that ever saved me. A person will remember you however it is convenient to remember you. But a timestamp remembers you exactly. And exactly is all an innocent person has ever needed. I stopped asking to be believed the day I understood that. I only ask, now,